Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The history of slavery in the Americas and its associated practices is often presented in schools as a detached narrative of economics and labor. Yet beneath this surface lies an array of deeply unsettling and systematically hidden truths. Among these obscured realities is the phenomenon of slave breeding, a brutal system that perpetuated the horrors of slavery in ways often overlooked in traditional curricula. This article seeks to explore this grim facet of history, uncovering aspects that many textbooks and classrooms have failed to illuminate. By delving into the unspoken history of slave breeding, we aim not only to educate but to provoke thought, reflection, and a deeper understanding of the cruelty endured by enslaved people and the legacy this system left behind. In the United States and across the Americas, the institution of slavery operated as a carefully orchestrated economic machine. From plantations in the Deep South to Caribbean sugar mills, enslaved Africans were treated not as human beings, but as commodities, tools to fuel the ambitions of wealth and power. While much attention is paid to the physical labor extracted from enslaved people, there is another aspect of this institution that demands attention: the systematic reproduction of enslaved populations through deliberate breeding practices. These practices were not only a means of sustaining slavery in a world where the transatlantic slave trade had been largely abolished, but also a chilling testament to the dehumanization of African people. At its core, slave breeding was about control. It was an effort by slaveholders to take ownership of not only the labor of the enslaved, but also their very bodies, dictating the most intimate aspects of their lives. Enslaved women were forced into reproduction, their wombs turned into instruments of profit. They bore children not for love or family, but because each child represented a new unit of labor, a new source of wealth for their captors. Enslaved men, too, were drawn into this system, sometimes compelled to father children under duress. Families were torn apart, and relationships were forged and destroyed under the watchful eyes of overseers who viewed enslaved people not as individuals, but as breeding stock. The economic motivations behind slave breeding were staggering. After the abolition of the international slave trade in the early 19th century, the domestic trade within the United States intensified. Slaveholders recognized that the only way to maintain their workforce was through reproduction. Enslaved women were incentivized, or more often coerced, to bear multiple children. In some cases, their fertility was monitored and manipulated through forced pairings. These practices were justified by slaveholders under the guise of economic necessity, masking the profound moral atrocities they entailed. The human cost of these practices was immeasurable. Enslaved women were denied agency over their own bodies, forced into repeated pregnancies with little regard for their health or well-being. The trauma of losing children, whether to death or to the slave auction block, was a constant shadow over their lives. Enslaved men, meanwhile, were often reduced to little more than breeders, stripped of the dignity of fatherhood and the ability to form meaningful relationships. The bonds of family, so integral to human experience, were systematically eroded by a system that prioritized profit over humanity. Slave breeding was not limited to physical coercion. It was also reinforced by cultural and institutional mechanisms that sought to justify its existence. Pseudoscientific theories of racial superiority were used to argue that African people were naturally suited to servitude and reproduction. Religious justifications, too, played a role, with some claiming that enslaved people were fulfilling a divine purpose by multiplying under the control of their masters. These narratives served to dehumanize enslaved people further, painting them as less than human and therefore unworthy of the basic rights and dignities afforded to others. The legacy of slave breeding is one that continues to reverberate through history. The systematic disruption of African family structures left scars that have yet to fully heal. Generations of African Americans grew up with the weight of this history, grappling with the knowledge that their ancestors were treated not as people, but as property. The psychological and emotional toll of this legacy is profound, shaping identities and communities in ways that are still being understood. It is essential to recognize that the practices of slave breeding were not universally acknowledged, even during the height of slavery. While some slaveholders openly embraced and profited from these practices, others sought to distance themselves from what they saw as a particularly odious aspect of the institution. However, this does not absolve the system as a whole. The fact that such practices were allowed to persist, and that they were often hidden or denied, speaks to the pervasive dehumanization that underpins slavery in all its forms. In examining the history of slave breeding, it is also crucial to consider the ways in which enslaved people resisted. Despite the immense pressures placed upon them, many sought to assert their humanity and protect their families in whatever ways they could. Women took extraordinary risks to prevent pregnancies or to hide their children from the prying eyes of slaveholders. Men and women alike formed secret relationships, defying the efforts of their captors to control their lives. These acts of resistance, though often small and private, were powerful assertions of agency and dignity in the face of overwhelming oppression. The erasure of slave breeding from mainstream narratives is not accidental. It is a reflection of the discomfort that comes with confronting the darkest chapters of history. By neglecting to teach this aspect of slavery, we allow myths and misconceptions to persist, perpetuating a sanitized version of events that fails to do justice to the lived experiences of enslaved people. To truly understand the history of slavery, we must confront its full reality, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it may be. The impact of slave breeding extends far beyond the confines of history books. It shapes the way we understand race, identity, and power in the modern world. The commodification of human life, the denial of agency, and the use of pseudoscience to justify oppression are not relics of the past. They are threads that continue to weave through the fabric of contemporary society. By examining the history of slave breeding, we can begin to unravel these threads and challenge the systems of inequality that persist to this day. As we reflect on this history, it is essential to honor the resilience and humanity of those who endured it. Enslaved people were not passive victims. They were individuals with dreams, desires, and a profound capacity for resistance. Their stories deserve to be told in full, not as footnotes to a larger narrative, but as central to our understanding of the past. By shedding light on the hidden history of slave breeding, we take a step toward acknowledging the full truth of our shared history and ensuring that the voices of the enslaved are heard and remembered.